Close your eyes and let the sounds of the modern world fade away for a moment. Imagine a place where the air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only music is the gentle rhythm of water against the shore. Long before the towering glass buildings and the hum of engines, there was only the river, a deep blue ribbon of water that connected the great inland seas of the north. This is where our story begins, in a land of silence and shadows, waiting for the first spark of a city to be born. Before we travel further back into these quiet woods, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you find peace in these stories, leave a comment below and let me know which part of the world you are listening from tonight. It costs you nothing, but it truly helps our channel grow and allows us to keep exploring history together. Now, let us return to the riverbank, where the mist is just starting to lift. For centuries, this land belonged to the rhythm of the seasons and the footsteps of the Anishinaabe people. They called this region home, moving through the forests with a deep respect for the spirits of the trees and the currents of the lakes. The water was their highway, and the fertile ground provided everything they needed to thrive. To them, the narrow passage of water between the two lakes was more than just a geographic feature. It was a sacred gateway, a place of meeting and trade, where the whispers of the wind told stories of the ancestors. In the summer of 1701, a different kind of sound began to echo across the water. It was the rhythmic splash of paddles from a small fleet of canoes, carrying men from a land far across the ocean. Leading them was a Frenchman named Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac. He wasn't looking for gold or spices, but for a strategic edge in the vast wilderness of the New World. As his eyes scanned the shoreline, he saw the potential of the high bluffs overlooking the narrowest part of the river. He called it Le Détroit, which simply means the strait. The Frenchmen stepped onto the muddy banks, their heavy boots sinking into the soft soil. They began to clear the ancient oaks and maples, the sound of axes striking wood, breaking the long silence of the forest. They built a small wooden fort, a tiny island of European order in a sea of green. They named it Fort Pontchartrain du Détroit. It was a humble beginning, just a collection of log cabins surrounded by a tall wooden fence, but it was the seed that would eventually grow into a titan of industry. Life inside the fort was slow and governed by the rising and setting of the sun. The settlers brought with them a unique way of mapping the land. They laid out what they called ribbon farms. These were very long, narrow strips of land that all touched the edge of the river. Every farmer wanted access to the water, not just for drinking and fishing, but because the river was the lifeblood of the community. It was their only connection to the outside world. In the winter, when the water turned to thick grey ice, the settlers would huddle inside their small homes, listening to the wind howl against the logs and dreaming of the first thaw of spring. The early years were a delicate dance of survival and cooperation. The French and the local tribes lived side by side, trading furs for blankets and metal tools. There was a strange, quiet beauty in this cultural blend. On a calm evening, you might hear the soft French songs of the voyageurs mingling with the steady beat of a drum from a nearby village. The air was clean, the water was clear enough to see the stones on the bottom, and the future felt as vast and open as the horizon itself. No one could have imagined that this quiet outpost would one day become the heartbeat of a global revolution. As the decades passed, the small settlement began to expand beyond the walls of the fort. The fur trade was booming, and beaver pelts were as good as gold. More families arrived, bringing with them seeds for apple orchards and roses from their homelands. The landscape was changing, Slowly but surely, as the wild forest gave way to tilled fields and dusty paths. Yet, the pace of life remained gentle. People moved at the speed of a horse or a sailing boat, and the concept of a crowded city was still a distant dream. There was time to breathe, time to watch the eagles soar, and time to appreciate the simple gift of a warm fire. But history is never still, even in the most peaceful of places. Far away in Europe, kings and generals were fighting for control of this wild continent. The quiet life on the banks of the Detroit River was about to be swept up in the tides of war and politics. The French flag, with its golden lilies, would not fly over the fort forever. New faces were appearing on the horizon, and they brought with them a different vision for what this land could become. The transition would be slow, like the changing of the leaves in autumn, but the old world was beginning to fade. As the sun begins to set on this early chapter of our story, the river remains the same. It flows steadily southward, carrying the memories of the French settlers and the indigenous people who first walked these banks. The fires in the small cabins are being lit, and the smoke rises in thin blue spirals toward the stars. The wilderness is still vast, and the silence is still deep, but the foundation has been laid. The story of Detroit is just beginning to find its voice, and soon, the quiet of the forest will be replaced by a new kind of energy. That new energy arrived on the winds of change, wearing the bright red coats of the British Empire. By 1760, the French had surrendered control of the fort, and a different language began to drift through the narrow wooden streets. The transition was relatively quiet, but beneath the surface, the native tribes who had traded peacefully with the French felt a deep unease. The British rules were stricter, and the once open gates of the fort seemed to close a little tighter. This tension eventually sparked a long, quiet siege led by the brilliant Chief Pontiac. For months, a heavy stillness hung over the riverfront as the two sides watched each other through the mist, waiting for the dawn. Eventually, the siege lifted, and life returned to a gentle, albeit cautious rhythm. The world outside was spinning faster, caught in the grip of the American Revolution, but Detroit remained a distant, isolated outpost. It wasn't until 1796 that the newly formed United States finally claimed the territory. A new flag, adorned with stars and stripes, was raised into the crisp northern air. Yet, despite the changing banners, the town itself looked much as it always had. It was a tight, chaotic cluster of wooden buildings, barns, and storehouses, all pressed closely together for warmth and security. The river was still the main road, but the paths inside the town were narrow dirt alleys, often muddy and choked with horse-drawn carts. The houses were made of dried pine and oak, their roofs coated in pitch to keep out the harsh winter snow. It was a cozy arrangement, but it was also a delicate trap waiting to be sprung. The people of Detroit lived their lives intimately connected to the warmth of their hearth fires, unaware that the very wood sheltering them would soon change their destiny forever. June 11th, 1805, began like any other calm, breezy summer morning. Somewhere in the heart of the settlement, perhaps from a baker's pipe or an overturned lantern, a single stray spark found a bed of dry hay. Within moments, the summer breeze caught the flame, carrying it to the wooden walls of the nearest barn. The fire did not roar immediately. It whispered its way up the dry timber, glowing bright orange against the morning light. But soon, the wind picked up, and the fire leaped from roof to pitch-covered roof with terrifying grace. The citizens rushed into the narrow streets, forming bucket lines from the river, their faces painted with the golden heat of the blaze. Despite their desperate, coordinated efforts, the fire was a force of nature that could not be tamed. The dry pine of the old French and British buildings fueled an inferno that consumed the entire settlement in a matter of hours. As the sun set that evening, the people stood on the riverbanks and in the shallow water, watching their history turn to white ash. When the morning dawned, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and charred wood. Where a bustling outpost had stood the day before, there was nothing left but a few blackened stone chimneys reaching silently toward the sky. It was a moment of profound devastation, a blank slate carved by destruction. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, there was no panic. The community gathered near the water, wrapping blankets around their shoulders against the morning chill. It was then that a local priest, Father Gabriel Richard, looked out over the smoldering ruins and spoke the words that would become the very soul of the city. He said, "Spirimus meliora, resurget cineribus." We hope for better things. It will rise from the ashes. Those words were not just a comfort. They were a promise planted in the scorched earth. Shortly after the fire, a man named Augustus Woodward arrived in the ruined town. He was a newly appointed judge for the territory, bringing with him a mind full of grand ideas and a vision of the future. Instead of simply rebuilding the chaotic, narrow streets of the past, Woodward looked at the empty, blackened ground and saw a magnificent canvas. Inspired by the wide avenues of Paris and the elegant layout of Washington, D.C., he began to draw a new map in the dirt. He envisioned a city of grand plazas, sweeping boulevards, and a hub-and-spoke design that would allow light and air to flow freely. The survivors, weary but determined, agreed to his bold plan. They drove wooden stakes into the ground, marking out wide avenues that radiated from central parks like the rays of a sun. They planted saplings that would one day grow into massive canopies of green. Brick by brick, a new settlement began to take shape, trading the claustrophobia of the old wooden fort for a sense of boundless optimism. Woodward Avenue was laid down, pointing directly north, a grand thoroughfare leading toward an unwritten future. The scars of the fire slowly faded under the foundations of new, sturdy buildings. The riverfront transformed once again, as docks were rebuilt stronger and longer than before. The air shifted from the scent of smoke to the smell of fresh lumber and wet mortar. The people of this reborn city did not know what the coming century would bring, but they had proven their resilience. The wide, dusty avenues stood ready, silently waiting for the heavy wheels of progress that were already beginning to roll across the continent. Those heavy wheels of progress found their path not just on the dusty avenues, but along a newly carved river of water far to the east. In 1825, the Erie Canal finally opened, connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. Suddenly, the journey to this remote outpost became a matter of days instead of arduous weeks. Steamboats began to replace the quiet canoes, their large paddle wheels churning the waters of the Detroit River with a steady, rhythmic splash. The air was filled with a new kind of energy, the sound of wooden crates being unloaded, and the chatter of new arrivals looking for a fresh start. These new arrivals brought skills that would slowly begin to transform the very nature of the city. They were blacksmiths, woodworkers, and mechanics, drawn by the endless supply of raw materials surrounding the town. The dense, ancient forests of Michigan were rich with oak, hickory, and ash. It was the perfect timber for building, not just houses, but vehicles. Detroit was waking up, stretching its limbs, and discovering that it had a natural talent for making things that moved. Soon, the wide avenues envisioned by Judge Woodward began to echo with the clatter of hooves and the rumble of wooden wheels. The city was quietly becoming a center for building carriages and wagons. In small brick workshops scattered across town, craftsmen worked by the warm glow of coal forges. They carefully shaped iron tires, bent wooden spokes, and stitched leather seats with a dedication to quality that would soon become famous. The scent of burning coal and fresh sawdust became the new perfume of the streets. It was a time of beautiful, meticulous handiwork. Each carriage was a testament to patience, built by men who took pride in the smooth curve of a varnished panel or the perfect balance of a wheel. The pace of manufacturing was still human, tied to the swing of a hammer and the strength of an arm. As these elegant carriages rolled out of the workshops and onto the cobblestones, they carried with them the growing reputation of a city that knew how to engineer motion. Detroit was no longer just a trading post. It was a place where things were crafted with purpose. Alongside the carriage makers, shipyards began to multiply along the riverbanks. The demand for freighters to carry copper and iron ore from the upper peninsulas down to the growing industrial centers was insatiable. The skeletal frames of massive wooden ships rose against the skyline, their hulls slowly taking shape under the hands of skilled carpenters. The river, once a silent highway for fur traders, was now a bustling artery of commerce. Yet, despite this growing industry, the city still retained a certain warmth, a feeling of a community working together under a shared, vast sky. As the 19th century drew to a close, the twilight of the carriage era cast long golden shadows across the brick-paved streets. The city was prosperous, confident, and perfectly positioned for what was to come. The workshops were full of tools, the warehouses were full of timber, and the minds of a few restless young men were full of crazy ideas about machines that did not need horses to pull them. A storm of innovation was gathering on the horizon, quiet at first, but carrying a spark that would soon ignite the entire world. That storm of innovation did not arrive with thunder. It began with the quiet, rhythmic tapping of a hammer in a tiny, drafty brick shed behind a modest house on Bagley Avenue. In the quiet, fading years of the 19th century, Detroit was a city caught between two worlds. By day, the streets belonged to the rhythmic clip-clop of horses and the elegant carriages of the wealthy. But by night, a new energy was humming just beneath the surface, driven by the steady, glowing pulse of electricity and coal. Here, a young, restless engineer named Henry Ford spent his evenings after working long, exhausting shifts at the Edison Illuminating Company. While the rest of the city slept beneath a blanket of stars, his small brick shed glowed with the warm, golden light of a single oil lamp. Ford was a man obsessed with a dream that many of his neighbors thought was completely foolish. He envisioned a carriage powered not by muscle and blood, but by a small, clever mechanical engine. The air in that shed was always thick with the heavy scent of lubricating grease, metallic dust, and pure, unwavering determination. He worked with his hands until they were stained black with oil, carefully filing down pieces of iron and brass, listening to the delicate scrape of metal against metal. In the damp, lingering spring of 1896, that quiet determination finally gave birth to something extraordinary. Ford called his delicate creation the quadricycle. It was a simple, fragile-looking machine, resting on four heavy wire bicycle wheels, with a small seat bolted to a wooden frame. It looked less like a modern car and more like a motorized buggy. But it was a marvel of personal engineering. On a rainy, cold night in early June, he finally had the little engine ready for its very first test. But in his intense focus on building the machine, he had made a slight miscalculation. The quadricycle was too wide to fit through the narrow door of the brick shed. Without hesitating, Ford grabbed an axe and knocked out the bricks around the doorframe, the sound of crumbling mortar breaking the midnight silence. He pushed the machine out into the cool rain, the glowing gas street lamps reflecting off the wet cobblestones and the polished brass fittings of the engine. He turned the heavy flywheel to start the motor, and suddenly a loud staccato popping sound echoed through the sleeping neighborhood. As he climbed onto the seat and grasped the tiller, the little machine lurched forward into the dark. For the first time, a Detroit-born automobile moved through the shadowy city streets under its own power, leaving a faint trail of exhaust in the damp night air. Ford was certainly not the only one tinkering in the shadows of the city. Across Detroit, other brilliant and stubborn minds were covered in motor oil, wrestling with gears and heavy iron pistons. Men like Ransom Olds, David Dunbar Buick, and the ambitious Dodge brothers were all chasing the same mechanical dream. Detroit was rapidly turning into an incredible laboratory of motion, a place where ideas were shared and fiercely debated over warm beers in local taverns. The old carriage workshops slowly began to adapt, swapping leather reins for wooden steering wheels and iron hitching posts for copper fuel tanks. However, in these early chaotic days, automobiles were still a rare, highly expensive luxury. They were handcrafted, one by one, for the very wealthy, who saw them as thrilling, noisy playthings for weekend excursions. These heavy, complicated machines would roar down the dirt roads outside the city, kicking up massive clouds of dust, much to the annoyance of local farmers and their easily spooked horses. They broke down constantly, requiring a mechanic to ride along just to keep the engine running. They were beautiful, but they were fragile and exclusive. Henry Ford, who had grown up on a quiet farm in Dearborn, possessed a much grander, simpler vision for the everyday person. He looked out past the city limits, out to the vast open fields and the deep, muddy, rutted country roads that stretched across America. He wanted to build a car so simple, so tough, and so reliable that any farmer, teacher, or factory worker could afford to explore the vast American landscape. He wanted a machine that could easily be repaired with standard tools, a mechanical workhorse that never grew tired and never needed to be fed. This singular vision began to take shape in a large red brick factory on Piquette Avenue. Inside the Piquette Avenue plant, the wooden floors were deeply stained with oil, and the air hummed with the sound of drafting compasses and quiet discussions. Ford and a small, fiercely loyal team of engineers worked secretly in a sealed-off room on the third floor. They experimented with a new, lightweight material called vanadium steel, an alloy brought over from Europe that was incredibly strong but remarkably light. After months of tireless design, sketching, and testing, in 1908, their vision became a tangible reality with the introduction of the Model T. The Model T was a masterpiece of practical, minimalist engineering. It sat high off the ground, allowing it to easily navigate over large rocks and deep mud that would trap heavier, more expensive luxury cars. The design stripped away all unnecessary ornamentation, focusing purely on survival, durability, and steady, relentless motion. It was easy to drive, with a simple planetary transmission that almost anyone could learn to operate in an afternoon. The Model T was not just a vehicle to look at, it was a promise of total freedom, a sturdy little companion for the open road. When the public finally saw what Ford had created, the response was unlike anything the industrial world had ever witnessed. The demand for this remarkable new machine was overwhelming, hitting the young company like a tidal wave of paper and ink. Letters, telegrams, and advance orders poured in from across the country, arriving much faster than the mechanics could ever hope to build the cars. Ford quickly realized that the old patient way of building carriages, with a team of men slowly assembling one vehicle from the ground up in a single spot, was completely broken. It was too slow, too expensive, and far too inefficient. He stood on the factory floor, watching the chaotic movement of parts and men, and he knew that everything had to change. He needed a way to build things faster, to make the heavy metal flow through the building like a continuous, unstoppable river. He needed to bring the work directly to the men, rather than having the men walk to the work. He needed a radically new system, one that would not just change the walls of his own factory, but would completely alter the very rhythm of human life forever. That radically new system began to take a physical shape just north of the city limits, in a massive, breathtaking complex known as the Highland Park plant. Designed by the brilliant architect Albert Kahn, it was unlike any factory the world had ever seen. Instead of dark, cramped brick walls, the building featured enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the interior with natural sunlight. People began to call it the Crystal Palace. Inside this vast, luminous space, Ford and his engineers began to experiment with the very concept of time and human motion. They observed how men worked, how many steps they took to fetch a wrench, and how long it took to tighten a single bolt. In 1913, they introduced a brilliantly simple, yet world-shattering idea. Instead of having workers walk around a stationary car, they placed the heavy metal chassis on rails and used a thick rope to slowly pull it across the factory floor. The building of a Model T was meticulously broken down into 84 distinct, highly specialized steps. One man would only attach the wheels. Another would only secure the steering column. The work came to the man, gliding along at a steady, relentless pace. The time it took to build a single automobile plummeted from over 12 hours to a mere 90 minutes. The modern moving assembly line had been born, and it moved with the unstoppable force of a mechanical river. The sensory experience inside Highland Park was completely overwhelming. The air vibrated with the continuous roar of heavy machinery, the hissing of steam valves, and the rhythmic, metallic clanking of 1,000 hammers striking steel. The smell of hot engine oil and vulcanized rubber hung thick in the air. It was a grand, complex orchestra of industry, playing a symphony of mass production. But for the men standing on the line, this new rhythm was incredibly punishing. Repeating the exact same physical motion hundreds of times a day, without ever pausing to rest or speak to a neighbor, drained their spirits. They felt less like craftsmen and more like organic cogs in a giant, unfeeling machine. Because the work was so monotonous and physically exhausting, the men began to leave. Turnover at the Highland Park plant soared to disastrous levels. Ford realized that a fast-moving assembly line was entirely useless if there was no one willing to stand beside it. He needed a way to keep his workers loyal, to give them a reason to endure the grueling, repetitive daily grind. The solution he found was so shocking, so unprecedented, that it made headlines in newspapers on every continent of the globe. It happened in January of 1914, during a bitterly cold Detroit winter, when the wind off the river cut like a knife. Ford called a press conference and announced the $5 day. He was voluntarily doubling the average industrial wage of his workers, paying them a staggering $5 for a single day of labor. Furthermore, he reduced the workday from 9 hours to 8. This clever adjustment allowed him to create 3 distinct shifts, meaning the great factory could run continuously, 24 hours a day, never sleeping, never stopping. The news sent shockwaves through the financial world, with many wealthy industrialists predicting that Ford would bankrupt his company within the year. But to the working-class people of the world, that $5 promise sounded like the ringing of a golden bell. The morning after the announcement, the bitter winter snow was trampled by the boots of over 10,000 men. They gathered outside the massive iron gates of Highland Park in the freezing darkness, desperate for a chance to secure a job that could change their families' destinies. The breath of this massive crowd rose into the cold dawn air like a thick white fog. It was the beginning of one of the greatest internal migrations in human history. Word of the $5 day quickly spread to the rural, dusty corners of the American South and crossed the ocean to the small, impoverished villages of Europe. Detroit was no longer just a city. It had become a glowing beacon of hope, a place where a man willing to work hard could finally build a life of dignity. The city's central train station became the bustling gateway to this new world. Every day, steam locomotives hissed to a halt, releasing thousands of weary but hopeful travelers, carrying worn cardboard suitcases and speaking dozens of different languages. Young farmers from Ohio, sharecroppers from Alabama, and immigrants from Poland, Italy, Ireland, and Greece poured into the city streets. Detroit absorbed them all, rapidly expanding its borders to accommodate the swelling population. Entire neighborhoods sprouted up seemingly overnight, filled with the comforting aromas of 100 different cultural cuisines blending together in the evening air. The city was transforming into a rich, vibrant melting pot, unified by the steady, shared rhythm of the factory whistle. This unprecedented wage did something far more profound than just fill the factories. It fundamentally altered the structure of society. For the first time in history, the people building the products earned enough money to actually buy them. A worker on the assembly line could save a portion of his $5 and, within a few months, purchase his very own Model T. He could buy a modest house with a small patch of green grass in the front yard. He could send his children to school instead of sending them to work in the coal mines. This was the quiet, monumental birth of the American middle class. The cycle of prosperity was firmly locked into place, and Detroit found itself floating on an ocean of unimaginable wealth. As the 1910s gave way to the roaring 20s, the city was flush with millions of dollars in automotive profits. The heavy industrial grit of the factories was producing a beautiful, sparkling byproduct. The civic leaders and automotive barons looked at their bustling, wealthy metropolis and decided that it was time to dress the city in garments worthy of its newfound status. They wanted to build monuments of glass, marble, and limestone that would rival the greatest capitals of Europe. The humble, quiet days of wooden carriages and brick sheds were entirely forgotten, as Detroit prepared to reach eagerly toward the sky. As the city reached eagerly toward the skyline of Detroit began to transform with a breathtaking, almost magical speed. The 1920s roared into existence, bringing with them a tidal wave of unimaginable wealth generated by the relentless, churning motion of the assembly lines. The automotive barons, flush with millions of dollars in new capital, decided that their gritty, industrial city needed to reflect the golden era they had single-handedly created. They hired the most visionary architects of the age, to replace the soot-stained brick of the 19th century with soaring, elegant monuments of steel, carved limestone, and gleaming glass. The crisp air above the city was constantly filled with the rhythmic sound of riveting hammers, the hiss of steam-powered cranes, and the distant shouts of steelworkers balancing bravely high above the busy streets. The architectural style they chose for this transformation was a dazzling, geometric celebration of the future known as Art Deco. It was a style that perfectly captured the optimistic spirit of the machine age, characterized by bold, sweeping lines, sharp angles, and intricate, stylized patterns that looked like they were in constant motion. Walking through downtown Detroit during this era was like stepping into a sprawling, open-air cathedral, dedicated entirely to commerce, art, and human progress. One of the most stunning examples to rise from the pavement was the Guardian Building, often lovingly called the Cathedral of Finance. Its towering, majestic exterior was clad in a custom-made, warm orange brick that seemed to absorb and glow softly in the late afternoon sun. Inside, the soaring vaulted ceilings were completely covered in vibrant, multicolored mosaics of Puabic pottery, a beautiful, iridescent clay tile crafted right there in the city by local artisans. Not far away from the glowing bricks of the Guardian stood the magnificent Fisher Building, an absolute masterpiece funded by the incredibly wealthy Fisher brothers. These brothers had made their vast fortune by building enclosed, weatherproof bodies for early automobiles, changing how people traveled. When they commissioned their tower, they gave the architect a simple, breathtaking instruction: create the most beautiful commercial building in the world and spare absolutely no expense in the process. Stepping into the grand lobby felt like walking into the interior of a royal European palace. The arcade was lined with 40 different kinds of rare marble, imported from ancient quarries all over the globe. Massive, heavy bronze chandeliers cast a warm, golden, flickering light over the smartly dressed people walking below, their footsteps echoing quietly against the highly polished stone floors. Topping the structure was a brilliant gilded roof that caught the morning light, shining like a golden beacon for miles in every direction across the flat Michigan landscape. Because of this incredible dedication to beauty, public art, and civic pride, people across the country began to refer to Detroit by a romantic, whispered new nickname. They called it the Paris of the West. It was very easy to see why, especially when strolling down the wide, elegant stretch of Washington Boulevard on a cool autumn evening. The clean streets were lined with lush, manicured green trees, high-end department stores boasting lavish window displays, and glowing street lamps that cast long, elegant shadows on the smooth pavement. Men in sharply tailored wool suits and fedoras walked comfortably alongside women in fringed silk dresses and stylish cloche hats, enjoying the crisp breeze blowing gently off the Detroit River. The city felt incredibly sophisticated, a place of high culture, fine dining, and endless, dazzling possibilities. The cultural life of the city expanded just as rapidly and vibrantly as its towering skyline. To entertain the booming, newly wealthy middle class, grand movie palaces were constructed, specifically designed to transport weary factory workers into entirely different magical worlds. The Fox Theatre was the undisputed crown jewel of these lavish entertainment temples. Passing through its heavy brass doors was like stepping straight into a vivid dream, woven from plush red velvet and shimmering gold leaf. The massive auditorium featured towering faux marble columns, intricate plasterwork decorated with exotic lions and dragons, and a massive ceiling carefully painted to look like a vast, starry night sky. when the massive Wurlitzer organ began to play before the film, sending deep, resonant, beautiful vibrations through the velvet seats, the exhausted men of the assembly lines could finally close their heavy eyes, sink back, and completely forget the smell of hot motor oil. There was a fascinating, almost poetic duality to Detroit during these golden years of the 1920s. Just a few short miles away from the quiet marble lobbies, the tuxedoed waiters, and the delicate teacups of downtown, the massive automotive factories continued their relentless, deafening rhythm. Henry Ford's new sprawling Rouge River complex was taking shape, an industrial leviathan so massive it had its own internal railroad system. The towering brick smokestacks pumped thick, grey, swirling clouds into the sky, and the heavy thud of the massive drop forges shook the earth day and night, vibrating through the soles of the workers' boots. It was a city of extreme beautiful contrasts, where the raw, gritty, sweating muscle of heavy industry directly financed the delicate, refined beauty of the arts. The two Detroits existed side by side, locked in a necessary, powerful embrace that drove the entire region tirelessly forward. When the sun finally set and the loud, wailing factory whistles blew to signal the end of the shift, the city transformed once again. The bright electric lights flickered on, illuminating the bustling, crowded avenues and the heavy clattering streetcars that sparked blue light along the overhead copper wires. In neighborhoods like Paradise Valley, the faint, lively, soul-stirring sounds of early jazz music drifted out of open apartment windows and crowded, smoky dance halls, mixing beautifully with the distant, steady hum of traffic. Detroit in the 1920s felt completely, wonderfully invincible, riding a towering wave of progress that seemed like it would never, ever break. The optimism of the people was as solid and unyielding as the heavy limestone buildings anchoring the city blocks. But beneath this glittering golden surface, a very different kind of industry was slowly beginning to take root in the shadows. While the city celebrated its vast wealth openly in the grand ballrooms and theaters, another, much more dangerous game was being played out on the dark, restless, icy waters of the Detroit River. A severe new law had just swept across the entire nation, outlawing the sale and manufacture of alcohol, and instantly creating a sudden, massive demand for the forbidden. Detroit, sitting perfectly positioned just a single narrow mile across the water from Canada, was about to discover its geographical advantage all over again. The ambitious people of the city were about to realize that moving cars along a bright assembly line wasn't the only way to make a fortune in the dead of night. That narrow, winding stretch of water between Detroit and Windsor, Canada, transformed into one of the most active and dangerous borders in the world. In the freezing, bitter winters of the early 1920s, the Detroit River would turn into a solid, jagged sheet of thick white ice. Under the cover of total darkness, when the heavy snow clouds blocked the moonlight, a silent, shadowy army went to work. They were not building cars. They were moving Canadian whiskey, rum and gin into the thirsty, dry heart of the United States. Men would wrap their car tires in heavy iron chains to grip the slippery ice, loading their trunks with wooden crates until the rear bumpers almost scraped the frozen surface. They drove slowly, with their headlights entirely turned off, listening intently for the terrifying sound of the ice beginning to crack beneath their heavy wheels. When the spring thaw arrived and the thick ice broke apart, the smuggling simply shifted to the open water. The incredible engineering talent that had built the city's automotive empire was suddenly redirected toward the lucrative art of evasion. Local mechanics took sleek wooden speedboats and secretly outfitted them with massive surplus Liberty aircraft engines left over from the First World War. These deep-hulled boats could cut through the dark water at impossible speeds, easily outrunning the heavy, slow-moving patrol vessels of the Coast Guard. It was a high-stakes, dangerous game of cat and mouse, played out on the gentle river currents, illuminated only by the occasional sweeping beam of a police searchlight cutting through the heavy midnight fog. The sheer volume of illegal spirits flowing across this narrow border was absolutely staggering. Historians estimate that at the peak of Prohibition, nearly 75% of all the illicit alcohol consumed in the entire United States passed through the Detroit area. It became known far and wide as the Windsor Funnel. The riverbanks were lined with hidden docks, secret underground tunnels dug beneath boathouses, and even heavy submerged cables used to pull sleds full of liquor silently beneath the water's surface. The money generated by this invisible trade was astronomical, quietly seeping into the city's economy and funding an entirely new, glamorous underground culture. Once the liquor made it safely to the muddy American shore, it vanished into a vast, complex network of hidden drinking establishments known as blind pigs. Finding one of these secret bars required knowing the right dark alley, the exact unmarked wooden door, and the specific rhythm of a secret knock. But stepping inside was like entering a completely different, magical universe. The freezing, gritty reality of the industrial streets was instantly replaced by the warm, soft glow of low-hanging lamps and the lush feel of velvet drapery. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, sweet perfume, and sharp gin. In the corner, a live jazz band would be playing a breathless, syncopated rhythm, pulling couples onto a crowded, polished wooden dance floor until the early hours of the morning. However, this glittering, forbidden nightlife was completely controlled by ruthless, invisible hands. The enormous profits of the Windsor Funnel gave rise to powerful, organized crime syndicates, the most notorious being a local group of young, fiercely loyal men known as the Purple Gang. They ruled the city's underworld from the shadows, operating with a cold, terrifying efficiency that kept rival syndicates from Chicago entirely out of Detroit. While the city danced and drank in the warm, hidden speakeasies, the Purple Gang maintained an iron grip on the supply lines, ensuring that the rivers of golden whiskey never stopped flowing. It was a dangerous, thrilling era that added a dark, romantic mystique to the city's rapidly growing legend. But the wild, intoxicating party of the Roaring Twenties could not last forever. In the autumn of 1929, the stock market completely collapsed, and the roaring music abruptly stopped. The Great Depression swept across the country like a freezing, suffocating wind, and Detroit, a city built entirely on the production of consumer goods, was hit harder than almost anywhere else. The massive assembly lines, which had run continuously day and night for years, suddenly ground to a devastating halt. The towering brick smokestacks of the Rouge plant stopped billowing their familiar grey clouds. The skies over the city finally cleared, revealing a bright, beautiful blue, but the silence that fell over the factory floors was heavy, terrifying, and deeply unnatural. The men who had traveled from all over the world to build the American middle class now found themselves standing in long, quiet lines, waiting in the biting cold for a bowl of watery soup and a piece of stale bread. The $5 day felt like a distant, impossible dream. Yet, even in the darkest, most desperate years of the 1930s, the resilient spirit of the city endured. Neighbors shared whatever meager food they had, gathering around small coal stoves to keep warm and tell stories to their children. The grand marble lobbies of the Art Deco skyscrapers remained largely empty, standing like quiet, beautiful ghosts of a prosperous past. Detroit was holding its breath, waiting patiently for the frozen economic gears of the country to begin turning once again. As the decade slowly drew to a close, the distant rumble of machinery finally began to echo through the empty factories once more. But the rhythm was different this time. The world was changing, and a dark, terrifying storm was gathering across the ocean in Europe and the Pacific. The United States government looked at the massive, dormant industrial power of Detroit and realized that the city's ability to bend steel and assemble engines on a colossal scale was no longer just about building luxury cars. It was suddenly a matter of global survival. The city was about to undergo its most profound, exhausting, and heroic transformation, yet trading the elegant curves of the automobile for the heavy, unyielding armor of war. That heavy, unyielding armor of war became an absolute, urgent necessity on a quiet Sunday morning in December of 1941. When the devastating news of the attack on Pearl Harbor finally reached the freezing, snow-covered streets of Detroit, the entire city collectively caught its breath. The lingering, anxious silence of the Great Depression was instantly shattered, replaced by a fierce, unified determination. Within a matter of mere weeks, the United States government issued a massive, unprecedented directive to the auto barons. The production of all civilian automobiles was to be completely and immediately halted. The gleaming, beautiful, chrome-trimmed luxury cars of the 1930s were pushed off the assembly lines, and the massive factories were ordered to retool for something entirely different. President Franklin Roosevelt looked at this sprawling, soot-stained industrial powerhouse and declared that it must become the great arsenal of democracy. The sheer scale of what was asked of the city was almost impossible to comprehend. They were asked to take the meticulous, highly organized system used to build fragile glass and lightweight steel sedans and use it to forge massive, impenetrable weapons of global destruction. Out in the muddy, frozen fields of Warren, just north of the city limits, the Chrysler Corporation achieved something miraculous. In a breathtakingly short amount of time, they erected the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant. It was a colossal, sprawling structure where the heavy, thundering M4 Sherman tanks were assembled piece by heavy iron piece, shaking the earth as they rolled out of the massive loading bay doors. But the most astonishing transformation occurred with the ambition to build aeroplanes. Before the war, heavy bombers were delicate, complex machines, meticulously handcrafted by skilled aviation mechanics in small hangars. The leading aviation experts of the day laughed at the idea that uneducated, rough automobile workers could ever figure out how to mass-produce an aircraft. Henry Ford, now an elderly, stubborn man, took this as a personal challenge. He promised the military that if they gave him the land and the blueprints, he would build a factory capable of producing a massive, four-engine bomber every single hour. It sounded like sheer madness, a boast fueled entirely by ego and impossible mathematics. To fulfill this wild promise, the Ford Motor Company cleared a vast stretch of quiet farmland near Ypsilanti, cutting down ancient trees and pouring millions of tons of fresh, gray concrete. They built a facility known as Willow Run. It was a building of such staggering, mind-bending proportions that the main assembly line had to be designed with a sharp 90-degree curve just to keep the factory entirely within the boundary lines of Washtenaw County. Walking from one end of the factory floor to the other took nearly an hour, a journey through a deafening metallic canyon of heavy industry. The air inside was constantly thick with the sharp scent of hot ozone from welding torches, the sweet smell of aviation fuel, and the heavy metallic dust of a million steel rivets being pounded into place. The machine they were building was the B-24 Liberator, an enormous, intimidating aircraft comprised of over 1 million individual, highly specific parts. But there was a critical, looming problem that threatened to stop the assembly lines before they even started. The young, strong men who had built the cars in the 1930s were rapidly boarding trains and ships, crossing the oceans to fight the war themselves. The factory floors were suddenly, quietly emptying out. To keep the relentless rhythm of the machines going, the government sent out a desperate, patriotic plea to the women of America, asking them to leave their quiet kitchens, schools, and offices and step into the loud, dangerous world of heavy manufacturing. The response was a magnificent, overwhelming tide of human courage. Hundreds of thousands of women tied their hair back in brightly colored bandanas to avoid getting caught in the spinning machinery. They pulled on heavy, stiff leather gloves and picked up the heavy, vibrating rivet guns that battered their shoulders and arms. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, flexing her bicep in a denim shirt, was not just a clever poster. It was a living, breathing reality, echoing through the cavernous halls of Willow Run. These women, many of whom had never held a power tool in their lives, quickly became masters of precision, their small, nimble fingers expertly wiring delicate electrical panels and fastening the heavy aluminum skins of the massive bombers. Alongside this incredible social shift, the factories brought about another massive, complicated wave of migration. The desperate need for hands pulled thousands of workers from the deep, rural South, bringing both white farmers and black sharecroppers into the crowded, frantic limits of the city. They arrived at the central train station, carrying everything they owned in cardboard boxes, stepping out into a chaotic, exhausted metropolis that never, ever slept. Housing was so incredibly scarce that strangers would rent the exact same bed in a boarding house, sleeping in 8-hour shifts while the other person stood on the assembly line. The tension in these overcrowded, sweaty neighborhoods occasionally boiled over into tragic violence, a painful reminder of the deep, unresolved fractures within the country they were all fighting to protect. Yet, despite the exhaustion, the harsh rationing of sugar and meat, and the constant underlying anxiety of receiving a tragic telegram from the front lines, the city performed a miracle. By 1944, Henry Ford's impossible, mad promise had actually come true. The massive, heavy doors at the end of the Willow Run plant rolled open, and a gleaming new B-24 Liberator was pulled out onto the tarmac exactly every 63 minutes. The gray, cloudy skies above Michigan were constantly filled with the deep, throbbing roar of test flights, a beautiful, terrifying sound that promised liberation to continents halfway across the globe. Detroit was bending steel and shaping aluminum at a pace that simply defied human logic. When the warm summer of 1945 finally arrived, bringing with it the long-awaited news of total victory and peace, the reaction in the city was pure, unbridled joy. Every factory whistle in the region blew simultaneously, a massive, deafening chorus of steam and triumph that echoed across the river. Strangers embraced in the streets, and heavy, colorful clouds of ticker tape rained down from the Art Deco skyscrapers of downtown. But beneath the wild celebration, there was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The men and women of Detroit had pushed themselves to the absolute physical limits of endurance, feeding the insatiable hunger of a global war. As the smoke slowly cleared and the weary soldiers began to sail back home, the massive, thundering factories suddenly grew quiet once again. The military contracts were abruptly cancelled, and the heavy tanks and bombers were no longer needed. The city stood at another fascinating crossroads, much richer and infinitely more powerful than it had ever been in its history. The people had saved the world, but now they wanted to enjoy the peaceful, comfortable life they had fought so fiercely to secure. As the 1940s gave way to a new decade, the factories began to clear away the heavy armor plating, preparing to replace the grey paint of war with the bright, dazzling chrome of a beautiful new golden era. That beautiful new golden era arrived with a blinding, optimistic flash of polished chrome and shimmering glass. As the 1950s dawned, the deep collective exhaustion of the war years finally began to fade, replaced by a massive, undeniable wave of national relief. The weary soldiers had returned home, carrying with them not just memories of foreign shores, but pockets full of saved wages and a desperate, burning desire to live a normal, beautiful life. The great, thundering factories of Detroit, which had spent the last 4 years stamping out heavy, olive-green metal for tanks and aircraft, were completely transformed. The gloomy, dark colors of the Great Depression were banished entirely, and the assembly lines were flooded with vibrant, joyful new hues. The city was about to produce machines that were no longer just focused on pure survival, but on absolute, joyful indulgence. The designers leading this post-war automotive revolution were no longer just engineers. They were bold, visionary artists. Men like Harley Earl looked up at the sleek silver fighter jets streaking across the sky and decided that the cars of the future should look like they were flying, even when they were parked quietly at the curb. They sculpted heavy steel into long, sweeping, majestic curves. They added massive, dramatic tail fins to the rear fenders, mimicking the rudders of rockets pointing toward the stars. The front bumpers became massive grills of gleaming, heavy chrome that caught the golden afternoon sun and reflected it back into the eyes of admiring pedestrians. Cars were painted in delightful, soft pastel colors that matched the joyful mood of the era. Beautiful shades of seafoam green, baby blue, and deep, luscious cherry red. Stepping into one of these magnificent land yachts was a deeply sensory, almost luxurious experience. The heavy, solid doors closed with a deep, satisfying thud, sealing you inside a quiet, rolling sanctuary. The seats were not just chairs. They were wide, plush benches, covered in soft, high-quality leather and colorful woven fabrics. Behind the steering wheel, the dashboard glowed with warm, beautifully designed dials that looked like expensive jewelry. And when you turned the silver key, the massive V8 engine resting under the long hood did not rattle or roar. It settled into a low, powerful, confident purr. It was a sound that promised absolute freedom, a smooth, effortless glide across an ocean of freshly paved American asphalt. With these beautiful new machines came an entirely new culture of youthful rebellion and evening entertainment. The wide, grand stretch of Woodward Avenue became the undisputed cruising capital of the world. On a warm summer night, the avenue would be packed with hundreds of slowly rolling cars, their polished paint mirroring the bright, colorful glow of the streetlights. Teenagers and young factory workers would drive up and down the boulevard, showing off their customized engines and enjoying the cool breeze flowing through their open windows. They would pull into massive, sprawling drive-in restaurants where the bright neon signs buzzed softly against the darkening sky. Waitresses on roller skates would glide smoothly between the parked cars, carrying heavy trays of hot hamburgers, salty fries, and thick, sweet vanilla milkshakes. This booming car culture also gave rise to the magical experience of the drive-in movie theater. Families and young couples could park their magnificent cars in wide, sweeping arcs under a canopy of bright stars. They would hook a heavy metal speaker to their partially rolled down window, listening to the crackling dialogue of Hollywood actors while sitting in the comfort of their own private, rolling living rooms. The smell of hot, buttery popcorn mixed with the faint scent of engine exhaust and the cool, damp night air. It was a deeply relaxing, shared communal experience that made the people of Detroit feel intimately connected to the wonderful machines they spent their days building. The city was not just manufacturing cars, it was manufacturing the very essence of the modern American dream. As these incredible vehicles became faster and more reliable, the physical landscape of the country began to bend and shift to accommodate them. The government embarked on the largest public works project in history, pouring endless ribbons of smooth gray concrete to create the massive interstate highway system. Suddenly, the narrow, dusty dirt roads of the past were paved over, replaced by wide, multi-lane expressways that cut through the forests and mountains. This meant that the men who worked in the hot, crowded factories no longer needed to live in the dense, smoky neighborhoods right next to the towering smokestacks. They could use their beautiful new cars to drive out toward the quiet, empty edges of the city, seeking a completely new way of life. This was the quiet, steady birth of the suburban dream. Vast tracts of farmland surrounding Detroit were rapidly transformed into peaceful, winding neighborhoods filled with affordable, newly built homes. Factory workers traded the noise of the streetcars and the shadows of the skyscrapers for their own private patch of bright green grass. On the weekends, the quiet suburban air was filled with the rhythmic sound of mechanical lawnmowers, the distant splashing of children playing in canvas pools, and the delicious, smoky scent of meat cooking slowly on charcoal grills. The population of Detroit swelled to an incredible peak of nearly 2 million souls, making it the fourth largest city in the nation. It felt like an unstoppable, glorious utopia for the working class, a place where endless prosperity was practically guaranteed. As the sun set over these peaceful new suburbs and the city lights flickered on, millions of hands reached for a small, round knob on their gleaming car dashboards. The push-button AM radio had become a standard feature, turning every single automobile into a private, rolling concert hall. The glowing vacuum tubes inside the dashboard warmed up, pulling invisible waves of music out of the cool evening air. And as the decade of the 1950s drew to a close, a completely new, electrifying rhythm began to transmit from the tall radio towers of the city. It was a beat that blended the soul of the gospel church, the smooth harmonies of the street corners, and the steady, relentless thump of the assembly line. Detroit was about to give the world a sound that would echo through history, and it started in a small, unassuming house on West Grand Boulevard. That small, unassuming two-story house on West Grand Boulevard did not look like the birthplace of a global cultural revolution. It was just a simple, white-framed residential building with a neat patch of green lawn and a large, inviting front window, blending perfectly into the quiet, tree-lined block. But suspended above the front door, a bold, confident blue and white sign hung in the gentle breeze, proudly declaring the building as Hitsville, USA. This modest home was purchased in 1959 by an ambitious, incredibly driven young man named Berry Gordy Jr. Gordy knew the heavy, exhausting rhythm of the city intimately, having spent his early days working the grueling, relentless assembly line at the massive local Lincoln Mercury automotive plant. As he attached heavy upholstery to the gliding metal frames of the luxury cars, breathing in the scent of hot oil and leather, his mind would wander, turning the loud metallic clanking of the factory floor into infectious rhythmic melodies in his head. He realized that if Detroit could build the most beautiful, reliable cars in the entire world by using a highly organized system of mass production, perhaps that exact same meticulous method could be used to build perfect, beautiful hit records. To turn this brilliant vision into a reality, he converted the small, cramped dirt floor basement of the house into a recording space that the musicians soon lovingly called the Snake Pit. The ceiling was incredibly low. The walls were heavily padded with soft acoustic tiles to absorb the sound, and the air was always thick with a hazy blue cloud of cigarette smoke and the warm glowing heat radiating from the vacuum tubes of the heavy amplifiers. It was a deeply intimate, almost magical space hidden beneath the quiet street. Down in this dark, cozy room, a remarkable, tight-knit group of studio musicians known as the Funk Brothers gathered together every single morning. They were seasoned, brilliant jazz and blues players, drawn from the city's smoky late-night music clubs, and they provided the incredibly tight, flawless musical foundation for almost every single song that ever left the building. They played their instruments with a fierce precision that rivaled the finest automotive engineering, locking into musical grooves that were so deep, so heavy, and so compelling that it was physically impossible to listen without tapping your foot to the steady, driving beat. Gordy treated his young record label, which he cleverly named Motown, as a heartfelt tribute to the Motortown, completely unlike any other music company in existence. He applied the strict, rigorous quality control of the heavy auto industry to the delicate, emotional art of making music. Every Friday morning, he would hold critical, highly competitive listening meetings, where a panel of judges would vote on which songs were truly good enough to be pressed into black vinyl. The artists who nervously walked through the front doors of Hitsville were usually just ordinary, working-class teenagers, plucked straight from the city's towering brick public housing projects and lively high school talent shows. But under Gordy's meticulous guiding hand, they were entirely transformed into polished, elegant royalty. Young, wide-eyed people like Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, and a blind, brilliant musical prodigy named Little Stevie Wonder found themselves standing in front of the heavy silver microphones, pouring their absolute souls into the spinning magnetic tape machines. The stunning transformation of these young artists did not simply stop at the edge of the soundproof recording booth. Gordy wanted his musical acts to be universally loved and respected, to project an image of absolute, undeniable, soaring grace. He hired a strict, deeply sophisticated woman named Maxine Powell to run a mandatory, in-house finishing school, teaching the teenagers how to speak eloquently, how to sit properly, and how to hold a microphone with delicate, effortless elegance. A brilliant, masterful choreographer named Cholly Atkins was also brought in to teach them perfectly synchronized, impossibly smooth dance routines. When the magnificent artists of Motown stepped onto the brightly lit stages of grand theaters across America, they did not just sing. They completely mesmerized the audience. The men wore incredibly sharp, tailored silk tuxedos, and the women sparkled in stunning, heavily sequined evening gowns that caught the brilliant, blinding glare of the stage spotlights. They were the very picture of sophisticated mid-century glamour, a beautiful, shining reflection of a city that was standing at the absolute, dizzying height of its global power. The unmistakable sound that emerged from that tiny, cramped basement on West Grand Boulevard was a perfect, brilliant sonic mirror of Detroit itself. It was heavy, driving, and relentlessly forward-moving, anchored by an iconic thumping bass line that pushed the rhythm forward exactly like a powerful, roaring V8 engine. Over this incredibly solid foundation, they layered the bright, shimmering strike of a tambourine, echoing the sharp, sudden hiss of a factory steam valve, combined with the lush, soaring, angelic harmonies of the incredibly talented vocalists. It was an optimistic, joyful, irrepressible sound that completely transcended the deep, painful, and complex racial divisions of the era. As the turbulent, socially explosive decade of the 1960s began to unfold, with the entire country marching bravely toward profound social change, the music of Motown acted as an incredibly powerful, unifying force. It was famously and accurately dubbed the sound of young America, and it spilled out of millions of glowing car radios, from the rocky, sun-drenched coast of California to the crowded, busy, towering streets of New York City. For a few glorious, golden, shimmering years, it felt as though the beautiful music echoing from the walls of Hitsville could somehow magically drown out any trouble looming on the distant horizon. The heavy black vinyl records spun endlessly on turntables across the globe, carrying the proud, rhythmic name of Detroit into millions of comfortable living rooms, completely masking the deep, complex anxieties that were slowly beginning to build back home. But while the world danced joyfully to the smooth, infectious rhythms of the Temptations and the Supremes, the physical landscape of the massive city that had birthed them was quietly, violently shifting. The magnificent metropolis of nearly 2 million people was finally reaching a dangerous breaking point, stretching its physical boundaries until the tight, intricate social fabric could no longer hold. Beneath the gleaming, polished chrome of the beautiful new cars and the soaring, joyful melodies of the hit records, deep, irreversible fractures were beginning to silently crack the foundations of the city's heavy concrete pavement. Those deep, silent fractures did not begin with a sudden, violent earthquake, but rather with the slow, deliberate pouring of fresh concrete. In the late 1950s, the ambitious, sweeping vision of the modern interstate highway system arrived at the city limits, bringing with it a massive, unstoppable fleet of heavy yellow bulldozers. The massive construction plan was presented as a glorious, necessary leap into the future, a way to move millions of automobiles in and out of the downtown core with absolute, uninterrupted speed. But to build these wide, sunken trenches of smooth grey concrete, the engineers had to carve devastating permanent paths directly through the very heart of the city. The deafening roar of heavy diesel machinery replaced the soulful music of the neighborhoods, as entire blocks of historic, tightly knit communities were systematically marked for total demolition. The most profound and heartbreaking destruction occurred in a vibrant, densely populated neighborhood known as Black Bottom, and its accompanying entertainment district, Paradise Valley. For decades, this area had been the incredibly rich, beating cultural heart of the city's black community, filled with hundreds of successful, independently owned businesses, crowded jazz clubs, and beautiful, historic brick churches. But the city planners, drawing cold, unfeeling lines on wide paper maps, labeled the bustling area as a slum, completely ignoring the deep generational roots and the thriving localized economy. Families who had lived there for generations were suddenly forced out of their homes, watching helplessly as the heavy iron wrecking balls swung through the warm summer air, shattering their front porches and turning their cherished living rooms into piles of red dust. Where thriving, colorful streets had once echoed with the laughter of playing children and the friendly calls of local grocers, a massive, deep canyon of blinding white concrete was laid down. This new, sunken highway, known as the Chrysler Freeway, functioned like a deep, unnatural river, physically cutting the city into isolated, disconnected pieces. The wide, sweeping overpasses built above the rushing traffic provided no comfort, acting instead as stark, heavy boundaries that separated people not just by geography, but by race and economic class. The beautiful, unified rhythm of the factory whistle that had once brought the entire metropolis together was slowly being replaced by the steady, isolating roar of high-speed traffic rushing past, never stopping to look at the neighborhoods left standing on the edge. As the massive new highways made it incredibly easy to travel long distances, the giant automotive companies began to look closely at their own operations within the crowded city. The old, towering brick factories that had built the magnificent cars of the 1920s and 30s were massive, multi-story buildings designed for a vertical style of manufacturing that was rapidly becoming obsolete. The new, modern method required vast, sprawling, single-level structures, where a continuously moving conveyor belt could run in a straight, uninterrupted line for over a mile. The dense, heavily populated city blocks of Detroit simply did not have the physical space for these massive new architectural footprints. And so, the great corporations began to quietly pack up their heavy machinery and move their operations out beyond the city limits, out to the wide, empty, affordable green fields of the distant suburbs. This slow, agonizing industrial exodus happened quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, like fine sand slipping slowly through an hourglass. A massive stamping plant on the east side would close its heavy iron gates for the final time, leaving hundreds of local, highly skilled men standing on the sidewalk with nowhere to go. Then, a towering assembly facility on the west side would fall silent, the tall brick smokestacks no longer painting the sky with the familiar, comforting gray clouds of steady, reliable employment. The massive, beautiful Packard automotive plant, once considered the absolute global pinnacle of luxury car manufacturing, was eventually abandoned, its millions of square feet of reinforced concrete slowly surrendering to the creeping green vines and the harsh, freezing Michigan winters. The very lifeblood of the city was quietly draining away, leaving behind massive, hollow monuments of a glorious, fading past. As the steady, high-paying factory jobs slowly vanished into the surrounding counties, the wealthy and middle-class residents naturally began to follow. The beautiful new ribbons of the interstate highway system made this flight incredibly easy, offering a fast, smooth escape route to the sprawling, quiet new subdivisions that promised low taxes and brand new, sparkling schools. But this suburban escape was not an option available to everyone. Through a complex, invisible web of discriminatory housing policies, strict banking redlining, and deep-seated social prejudice, the city's rapidly growing black population was heavily restricted from buying homes in these shiny new suburban communities. They were firmly locked inside the city limits, trapped in aging, overcrowded neighborhoods, just as the powerful economic foundation began to completely crumble beneath their feet. With every moving truck that drove out of the city, headed for the perfectly manicured lawns of the suburbs, Detroit lost a tiny, vital piece of its economic survival. The vast, crucial tax revenue that was desperately needed to keep the streetlights glowing, the parks green, and the public schools running began to shrink at an alarming, catastrophic rate. The grand Art Deco skyscrapers downtown began to defer their expensive maintenance, their glowing golden roofs gathering a dull, neglected layer of dark city soot. The beautiful, lush public parks, where families had once picnicked in the golden years, grew unkempt and wild. The magnificent metropolis that had once confidently called itself the Paris of the West was suddenly struggling to simply pay for basic, everyday services, beginning a slow, painful financial starvation that tested the absolute endurance of those who remained. By the mid-1960s, the atmosphere inside the city limits had fundamentally changed, growing incredibly tense and deeply suffocating. The air no longer smelled entirely of sweet progress and hot steel. It carried the bitter, sharp scent of deep, unresolved frustration. The unemployment rate among the young men remaining in the city began to skyrocket, leaving them to stand on the crowded street corners under the blazing summer sun, feeling completely disconnected from the glittering, wealthy promise of the American dream that was constantly advertised on their television sets. The police force, which did not reflect the diverse, changing racial makeup of the city, patrolled the streets with an aggressive, heavy-handed approach that only served to tightly compress the building anger, like a heavy steel lid locked tight on a boiling, hissing pressure cooker. The long summer of 1967 was unusually hot, the air thick, humid, and completely unmoving, hanging heavily over the brick houses and the quiet, simmering neighborhoods. The people of Detroit were waiting, deeply exhausted and incredibly anxious, feeling the immense invisible pressure building up in the very concrete beneath their shoes. They did not know exactly what was coming, but everyone could feel that the beautiful, fragile illusions of the golden era had finally completely shattered. The heavy, locked lid of the pressure cooker was groaning under the immense strain, and it would only take one small, seemingly insignificant spark in the deep, sweltering heat of a July night to finally blow the entire city wide open. That small, seemingly insignificant spark finally ignited in the suffocating early morning darkness of July 23rd, 1967. The streets were entirely quiet, wrapped in a thick, unyielding blanket of summer humidity, when police raided an illegal after-hours drinking club, known locally as a Blind Pig, on the corner of 12th Street and Claremont. What began as a standard, routine arrest in the shadows slowly drew a crowd of exhausted, frustrated residents who had been standing on the absolute edge of their patience for years. In the heavy, tense atmosphere of the sweltering night, the invisible, tightly compressed anger of the neighborhood finally broke through the surface. A single glass bottle was thrown, shattering loudly against the pavement, and with that piercing sound, the fragile, decades-old illusion of urban harmony shattered right alongside it. The pressure cooker had finally blown wide open, releasing a staggering wave of unrest that would fundamentally alter the destiny of the city forever. Over the next 5 long, chaotic days, the landscape of Detroit transformed into something entirely unrecognizable. The deep, beautiful blue of the summer sky was entirely eclipsed by thick, towering columns of dark gray smoke, rising steadily from burning businesses and heavily damaged storefronts. The cheerful, driving rhythm of the Motown bass lines drifting from open apartment windows was abruptly replaced by the haunting, continuous wail of emergency sirens echoing endlessly down the wide, tree-lined boulevards. It was not a battle in the traditional sense, but rather a tragic, chaotic unraveling of the social fabric, a desperate expression of deep, systemic pain that had been ignored for far too long. The golden, shimmering era of the post-war boom was violently burning away, leaving behind the stark, blackened skeletons of brick buildings that would stand as tragic monuments for generations to come. The sheer scale of the unrest overwhelmed the local authorities so completely that the federal government was eventually forced to intervene. In a deeply surreal, profoundly chilling echo of the city's wartime past, heavy military tanks once again rolled down the paved streets of Detroit. But this time, they were not rumbling proudly out of the massive arsenal plants on their way to a distant foreign war. They were navigating the quiet, familiar residential neighborhoods, their heavy steel tracks biting deeply into the soft, hot asphalt of Woodward Avenue. Thousands of armed National Guardsmen and federal paratroopers established heavily fortified checkpoints on the city corners, enforcing a strict, heavy curfew that plunged the massive metropolis into an eerie, terrifying silence every single evening. The city that had proudly armed the world to fight for freedom now found itself occupied by its very own military. When the heavy smoke finally cleared and the exhausted troops packed up their gear and withdrew, the physical and emotional scars left behind were almost too vast to fully comprehend. Entire city blocks had been completely reduced to grey ash and jagged, broken glass, resembling the devastated landscapes of the war-torn Europe that Detroit had worked so fiercely to liberate just 2 decades prior. But the most profound, devastating damage was entirely invisible to the naked eye. The deep, essential trust between neighbors and the fundamental belief in the shared, beautiful destiny of the city had been completely incinerated. A heavy, melancholic sadness settled over the remaining brick houses, a quiet realization that the magnificent, roaring Paris of the West would never, ever be the same again. The tragic events of that long, hot summer acted as a massive, powerful catalyst, rapidly accelerating the slow industrial exodus that had already begun in the previous decade. The quiet, steady trickle of moving trucks leaving the city suddenly turned into a massive, unstoppable river of outward migration. The wide, sweeping lanes of the newly built interstate highway system, originally designed to bring people together, were now functioning as massive, high-speed escape routes. Hundreds of thousands of middle-class families packed up their station wagons, turning the ignition keys and driving out past the city limits, seeking the quiet safety and manicured lawns of the distant, expanding suburbs. They took with them their tax dollars, their thriving small businesses, and a massive portion of the city's remaining economic lifeblood, leaving behind a sprawling, hollowed-out urban core that was suddenly struggling simply to survive. As the calendar painfully turned from the tumultuous 1960s into the uncertain decade of the 1970s, the heavy, lingering silence in the city only seemed to deepen. The magnificent, bustling energy that had once defined the downtown streets slowly faded away, replaced by the quiet, whistling wind blowing through abandoned, boarded-up storefronts. Even the soulful, beating musical heart of the city eventually decided to pack its bags. In 1972, Berry Gordy quietly moved the entire Motown Records operation out of the cramped, magical basement on West Grand Boulevard, relocating the company to the sunny, glittering coast of Los Angeles. The departure of that joyful driving rhythm felt like the absolute final closing of a magnificent chapter, a quiet admission that the beautiful golden era of Detroit had truly, completely come to an end. The global economic landscape was also violently shifting, bringing massive dark storm clouds to the great automotive factories that still remained. A severe international oil crisis sent shockwaves across the country, causing the price of gasoline to skyrocket almost overnight. Suddenly, the massive, beautiful, chrome-draped land yachts that Detroit had proudly built its entire empire upon were viewed as wasteful, inefficient dinosaurs. Consumers began turning their eyes towards smaller, highly efficient, economical cars, imported from entirely different continents. The massive assembly lines, accustomed to an endless, insatiable demand, suddenly found themselves slowing down, their heavy gears grinding against the harsh, undeniable reality of a rapidly changing modern world. In a desperate, massive attempt to reverse this overwhelming tide of abandonment and decay, the city's leaders joined forces with the remaining automotive barons to build a towering, symbolic fortress of hope. They poured millions of dollars into the construction of the massive Renaissance Center, a breathtaking, futuristic complex of towering, circular glass skyscrapers situated right on the edge of the Detroit River. It was designed to completely revitalize the downtown core, reaching boldly into the sky like a giant, gleaming monument of renewed optimism. But from the ground, the massive concrete protective berms that surrounded the base of the towers made the beautiful complex look like a heavy, isolated fortress, completely cut off from the struggling, quiet city blocks that stretched out behind it. As the sun set on the 1970s, casting long, melancholic shadows across the vast, empty parking lots and the silent, towering brick smokestacks, Detroit found itself entering a long, dark, and deeply challenging winter. The magnificent metropolis, which had quite literally put the entire world on wheels and armed the greatest generation, was slowly fading into a quiet, misunderstood symbol of industrial decline. The vibrant, roaring engine of America was quietly powering down, preparing to enter a long, difficult era of heavy rust, deep reflection, and profound, quiet solitude. That long, difficult era of heavy rust and quiet solitude settled over the massive city like a thick, gray winter blanket. As the 1980s slowly unfolded, the entire region surrounding the Great Lakes was given a heavy, melancholic new title by the rest of the world. They began to call it the Rust Belt. It was a term that perfectly captured the physical and emotional reality of a landscape built entirely on heavy iron and raw steel, now left completely exposed to the harsh, freezing elements of a changing global economy. The oxidation process was no longer just a simple chemical reaction happening on abandoned car frames. It was a profound metaphor for the slow, quiet decay of the American industrial dream. The bitter wind blowing off the deep, icy waters of the Detroit River seemed to carry a new, hollow sound, whistling softly through thousands of broken factory windows and empty, echoing brick corridors. Inside those massive, abandoned factories, the physical transformation was both terrifying and deeply, strangely beautiful. The towering, multi-story brick buildings that had once housed tens of thousands of sweating, ambitious workers were now completely, utterly silent. The deafening, rhythmic roar of the heavy drop forges and the constant, hissing steam of the assembly lines had entirely vanished, replaced by the soft, steady drip of rainwater leaking through collapsed wooden roofs. The heavy, iron machinery that was simply too large and too expensive to move was left behind, sitting silently in the dark like the massive, sleeping skeletons of extinct metallic dinosaurs. Dust motes danced quietly in the thin shafts of pale sunlight that managed to pierce through the grime-covered skylights, illuminating vast, empty concrete floors where the very wealth of the modern world had once been tirelessly forged. The quiet halting of these massive gears was driven by forces far beyond the city limits, echoing across distant oceans and continents. The changing global landscape had introduced highly efficient automated methods of manufacturing, and smaller, incredibly reliable vehicles were arriving on massive cargo ships from entirely different corners of the world. The giant automotive corporations that still remained in the city were forced into a desperate, ruthless period of downsizing to simply stay alive. They severed the deep historical ties with the dense urban neighborhoods, preferring to build entirely new, sterile robotic facilities in the distant, sprawling suburbs or across international borders. The proud, calloused hands of the Detroit factory worker were slowly replaced by the cold, precise movements of hydraulic arms and computer-guided welding machines, leaving tens of thousands of human beings standing in the quiet shadows of obsolescence. As the steady, reliable paychecks completely vanished, the dense, vibrant neighborhoods that had faithfully surrounded these giant factories began to physically dissolve. The beautiful, closely packed wooden houses with their wide, inviting front porches were slowly abandoned by families who had absolutely no choice but to travel thousands of miles to find new work. Left empty and entirely unprotected, many of these historic homes slowly fell into disrepair, their wooden frames sagging heavily under the immense weight of the accumulating winter snow. Eventually, the city was forced to bring in heavy yellow bulldozers to clear the dangerous, collapsing structures, entirely erasing whole blocks of human history. In their wake, they left behind vast, incredibly quiet stretches of empty, flat land, right in the very center of the bustling metropolis, creating a surreal, haunting landscape that people began to gently call the urban prairie. Within these vast, quiet urban prairies, something incredibly profound and entirely natural began to slowly take place. Mother Nature, patient and eternally resilient, began to softly, beautifully reclaim the heavy gray concrete. Thick, winding green vines of ivy crept silently up the sides of abandoned Art Deco skyscrapers, attempting to pull the carved limestone back down into the earth. Tall wild grasses and beautiful brightly colored wildflowers pushed their way violently through the cracks in the wide, empty asphalt parking lots. Entire city blocks that were once defined by the heavy smell of motor oil and the loud chatter of playing children were suddenly transformed into quiet, lush green meadows. Wild pheasants, red foxes, and even white-tailed deer began to wander freely down the silent, forgotten avenues, creating a peaceful, dreamlike atmosphere where the massive ambitions of the industrial age were slowly being swallowed entirely by the quiet, eternal rhythms of the natural world. Yet, amidst this sweeping, quiet return to nature, a fiercely loyal and incredibly stubborn population remained firmly rooted in the city. The people who stayed in Detroit during the difficult years of the 1980s and 90s were not victims. They were the absolute, resilient soul of the metropolis. They refused to surrender their deep, generational love for their home, finding brilliant, quiet ways to survive in the growing isolation. On broken blocks, where only 2 or 3 houses still stood, neighbors formed incredibly tight, protective bonds, sharing hot meals, looking out for each other's children, and faithfully keeping their warm yellow porch lights glowing brilliantly against the encroaching darkness. They took it upon themselves to mow the wild, overgrown grass of the empty lots next door, planting vibrant community gardens in the very same soil where massive automotive parts had once been stored. This deep, persistent human energy also found a brilliant, entirely new way to express itself in the dark, empty spaces left behind by the fleeing industries. As the 1990s slowly progressed, a completely new, deeply hypnotic rhythm began to pulse through the dark, abandoned warehouses of the city. Young, visionary musicians, surrounded by the towering, silent monuments of the machine age, began to experiment with entirely new electronic instruments, glowing synthesizers, and heavy drum machines. They created a stark, driving, incredibly futuristic sound that perfectly mirrored the cold mechanical reality of their surroundings, while infusing it with a deep, undeniably human soul. This beautiful, repetitive, highly electronic music was called Detroit techno, and it echoed loudly off the bare brick walls of the empty factories, eventually spreading across the vast ocean to completely dominate the global underground music culture of the modern era. The quiet, persistent heartbeat of the underground music scene proved that the creative, building spirit of the city had never actually died. It had merely gone into a deep, necessary hibernation. But to the outside world, glancing only briefly at the negative headlines or seeing the dramatic photographs of the empty, crumbling theaters, Detroit seemed like a massive, magnificent ship that had finally, permanently settled on the dark bottom of the ocean. As the turbulent, exhausting 20th century slowly drew to a definitive close, the city found itself existing in a state of profound, almost breathless suspension. The loud, roaring engines of the past had completely ceased. The dust of the heavy demolition had finally settled, and the vast, empty streets were cloaked in an unbelievable, heavy stillness. The remaining citizens braced themselves, waiting patiently in the quiet, atmospheric ruins to see what the dawn of a completely new millennium might eventually reveal. What the dawn of that new millennium eventually revealed was a massive city suspended in a breathtaking, almost cinematic state of quiet animation. The year 2000 arrived without the flying cars or the gleaming, futuristic utopias that the engineers of the 1950s had confidently promised. Instead, the deep, freezing Michigan winters and the warm, humid summers continued their slow, patient work on the abandoned architecture of the industrial age. Detroit had transformed into an incredibly vast, open-air museum of modern ruin, a place where the magnificent, towering ambitions of the 20th century were left completely exposed to the quiet mercy of time. The wide, silent streets felt like the beautiful, haunting backdrop of a forgotten film, where the incredibly complex machinery of human progress had been suddenly, mysteriously switched off. The undisputed, melancholic crown jewel of this silent empire was the Michigan Central Station. Rising 18 stories above the surrounding, quiet neighborhoods of Corktown, this colossal Beaux-Arts masterpiece had once been the bustling, beating gateway to the entire region. In its golden years, the massive marble waiting room had echoed with the excited chatter of thousands of travelers, the sharp whistle of arriving steam locomotives, and the hurried footsteps of soldiers marching off to distant wars. But now, the massive brass ticket windows were entirely empty, and the breathtaking vaulted ceilings covered in beautiful Guastavino tiles looked down upon a completely silent, flooded marble floor. The heavy, ornate iron clocks hanging from the walls were permanently frozen, their rusted hands completely paralyzed, as if the massive building itself had chosen to simply stop keeping track of the passing days. This breathtaking, tragic beauty did not go completely unnoticed by the outside world. A completely new wave of visitors began to travel to the city, arriving not to build heavy automobiles, but to capture the haunting, poetic aesthetic of the monumental decay. Photographers, artists, and curious travelers from across the globe walked quietly through the empty, echoing halls of the grand, ruined theaters and the massive, silent automobile plants. They were deeply captivated by the stark, impossible contrast between the intricate, beautiful craftsmanship of the past and the wild, creeping green vines of the present. This intense visual fascination brought a strange dual reality to the city. To the outside observer, the crumbling brick walls were a beautiful, artistic warning about the fragile nature of an empire. But to the stubborn, incredibly resilient people who still called the city home, it was a painful, constant reminder of what had been lost. Yet, even within these massive, decaying structures, a vibrant, undeniably human energy refused to completely disappear. The empty walls of the abandoned factories, like the massive Fisher Body Plant No. 21, were slowly transformed into towering, completely unauthorized art galleries. Brilliant, anonymous street artists climbed the crumbling concrete staircases under the cover of total darkness, using vibrant, glowing cans of spray paint to breathe magnificent, colorful new life into the dull, gray ruins. They painted massive, intricate murals of beautiful faces, abstract shapes, and profound poetic messages of survival that could be seen from the distant highway. These spectacular bursts of neon color against the rusted iron frames proved that the creative building soul of Detroit was still very much alive, searching desperately for a brand new canvas in the quiet shadows. However, while the outside world admired the tragic, poetic beauty of the city's architecture, the harsh, unforgiving economic realities of the modern world continued to batter the region. The brutal global financial crisis of 2008 struck the remaining automotive industry like a massive, devastating earthquake. The giant corporations that had built the city's entire foundation were suddenly pushed to the absolute, terrifying brink of total collapse, requiring massive, unprecedented interventions just to keep their remaining assembly lines slowly turning. The financial shockwaves rippled violently through the already exhausted city, leading to thousands of painful foreclosures that emptied out even more of the historic, quiet residential blocks. The magnificent metropolis was physically and financially bleeding, trapped in a long, agonizing downward spiral that seemed completely and utterly impossible to stop. This long, agonizing financial descent finally reached its absolute, inescapable rock bottom in the sweltering, humid heat of July 2013. Carrying a staggering, incomprehensible debt of over $18 billion, the great city of Detroit officially filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in the entire history of the United States. It was a deeply humbling, incredibly painful moment of global reckoning. The physical manifestation of this financial collapse was impossible to ignore. Basic, essential city services were stretched completely beyond their breaking point. Nearly 40% of all the streetlights in the city were broken or entirely shut off, plunging vast, sprawling neighborhoods into a deep, terrifying darkness every single night. The city parks grew wild and completely unmanaged, and the heavy, melancholic feeling of total abandonment settled over the paved streets like a thick, gray fog. But in that profound, heavy darkness, when the entire world had confidently written the final tragic obituary for the Paris of the West, something entirely unexpected began to quietly happen. The absolute rock bottom provides a very specific, undeniable kind of clarity. When there is absolutely nowhere left to fall, the only possible direction left to look is up. The heavy, suffocating burden of the massive historical debt was finally legally stripped away, providing the exhausted city government with a completely blank financial slate. And for the fiercely stubborn, deeply loyal residents who had weathered the decades of storms, the bankruptcy was not an ending, but a necessary, painful clearing of the overgrown brush. It was a chance to finally stop trying to desperately save the massive, bloated city of the 1950s and begin focusing entirely on building a sustainable, beautiful city for the future. The incredibly low cost of living and the vast, empty spaces began to attract a completely new generation of quiet pioneers. Young entrepreneurs, urban farmers, and visionary chefs realized that Detroit offered a strange, intoxicating freedom that simply did not exist in the crowded, incredibly expensive coastal cities. You could buy a massive, beautiful historic brick home for the price of a used car, or purchase an empty, sun-drenched lot to start a thriving community farm. In the quiet, forgotten corners of the city, small, beautifully designed coffee shops, independent bookstores, and cozy restaurants began to gently open their doors, casting warm, inviting yellow light out onto the cracked sidewalks. They were not massive, sprawling factories employing tens of thousands of people, but they were the vital, necessary seeds of a completely new, hyperlocal economy. As the heavy, terrifying dust of the bankruptcy proceedings finally began to settle, a completely new, quiet energy started to take deep root in the dark soil. The long, difficult winter of the Rust Belt era was finally, slowly beginning to thaw. The incredibly heavy silence of the abandoned factories, which had haunted the city for over 3 decades, was no longer a sound of defeat. It had become a peaceful, necessary rest, a quiet pause between two completely different movements of a grand historical symphony. The beautiful Blue River continued to flow steadily past the skyline, carrying the icy memories of the French fur traders, the early auto barons, and the brilliant Motown musicians, waiting patiently for the dawn of a magnificent, undeniable rebirth. That magnificent, undeniable rebirth began not with a deafening roar, but with a quiet, brilliant cascade of light. For years, vast stretches of the city had been swallowed by a heavy, intimidating darkness every single night, as the bankrupt infrastructure simply failed to keep the old street lamps burning. But as the city emerged from its financial ruins, a massive, determined effort was launched to bring the light back to the neighborhoods. Slowly, street by street, block by block, brand new, brilliant LED lights were installed atop the tall wooden poles. When the sun dipped below the horizon, millions of crisp, bright white lights suddenly flickered on across the vast urban landscape, illuminating the cracked sidewalks and the quiet front porches. It was a deeply symbolic, incredibly emotional moment for the people looking out of their living room windows, a clear, undeniable signal that the long, dark winter of the city was finally over. In the heart of the downtown core, the visual transformation was absolutely breathtaking. For decades, the preferred method of dealing with old, empty architecture was simply to bring in the heavy wrecking balls, tearing down history to create empty, flat parking lots. But a new generation of developers and city planners looked at the magnificent, soot-covered art, deco skyscrapers, and saw an irreplaceable, priceless heritage. The tall, yellow construction cranes finally returned to the city skyline, but this time, they were not destroying the past. They were meticulously, lovingly restoring it. Beautiful, iconic structures, like the towering book tower, which had sat empty and rotting for over 30 years, were completely stripped down to their bare steel and slowly brought back to a glorious shimmering life. The intricately carved limestone was carefully scrubbed clean. The shattered windows were completely replaced with gleaming new glass, and the grand, vaulted marble lobbies were once again open to the warm morning sunlight. Perhaps the most profound, emotionally resonant symbol of this massive restoration effort took place in the quiet neighborhood of Corktown. The colossal, ruined Michigan Central Station, which had stood for decades as the ultimate, tragic global symbol of Detroit's spectacular decline, caught the attention of the Ford Motor Company. In a brilliant, highly symbolic move that felt like a perfect, completed circle of history, the very company that had put the world on wheels purchased the massive, ruined train station. They embarked on an incredibly complex, multi-year mission to completely restore the majestic building, draining the flooded marble floors and faithfully repairing the beautiful, vaulted ceiling tiles one by one. The massive brass clocks that had been permanently frozen in time were repaired and finally began to tick once again, echoing softly through the grand, luminous waiting room. It was no longer a beautiful, tragic tomb of the industrial age. It had been transformed into a bright, bustling campus of modern innovation, entirely dedicated to designing the quiet electric vehicles of the future. But the true, beating heart of Detroit's rebirth was never just found in the shadow of the downtown skyscrapers. It was deeply rooted in the vast, sprawling residential neighborhoods. The thousands of acres of quiet, empty land that had been reclaimed by nature were now being intentionally cultivated by the residents themselves. Detroit slowly became a global pioneer in the beautiful, sustainable art of urban farming. Vast, vibrant green rows of fresh vegetables, bright yellow sunflowers, and sweet fruit trees began to grow from the very same soil where massive, heavy auto parts had once been carelessly dumped. Local residents worked quietly together in the warm afternoon sun, pulling weeds and harvesting fresh, healthy food for their own communities. It was a profound, quiet revolution, a way of planting tiny, delicate seeds of hope directly into the ashes of the old industrial empire, proving that the land could still provide a beautiful, nurturing life without the need for massive brick smokestacks. The heavy, deafening industrial symphony of the 20th century has been entirely replaced by a completely new, much gentler rhythm. The air is no longer thick with the sharp scent of burning coal or the heavy, metallic dust of the massive drop forges. Instead, the modern city hums with the quiet, high-tech energy of electric batteries and wind turbines. The massive, sprawling Rouge complex still builds trucks, but the roof of the factory is now entirely covered in living, green vegetation, blending the heavy muscle of manufacturing with a deep, newfound respect for the delicate balance of the natural environment. Detroit has learned from the painful, exhaustive mistakes of the past, realizing that progress does not always have to be measured in the sheer volume of smoke pumped into the sky, but can instead be measured by the steady, sustainable health of the community below. This deep, renewed connection to nature is most beautifully realized along the gentle, sweeping curve of the Detroit River. For over a century, the city's magnificent waterfront was entirely blocked by heavy concrete warehouses, massive cement silos, and barbed wire fences, treating the beautiful Blue River simply as an industrial dumping ground. But over the last 2 decades, the city slowly tore down the ugly concrete barriers, replacing them with a stunning, miles-long public riverwalk. Now, on a quiet, warm summer evening, you can walk peacefully along the water's edge, listening to the soft, gentle splashing of the current against the stone banks. You can watch the massive, silent lake freighters glide slowly past, carrying their heavy loads under the elegant, sweeping cables of the Ambassador Bridge, exactly as they have done for over 100 years. It is a deeply peaceful, restorative place, where the citizens can finally, freely enjoy the very waterway that first brought the French canoes to these shores so many centuries ago. The people who walk along that river tonight are the living, breathing legacy of a metropolis that simply refused to fade away. They are the great-grandchildren of the Polish mechanics, the Southern farmers, and the brilliant Motown musicians. They carry within them the unparalleled resilience of a city that survived a devastating fire, built the modern middle class, armed the world for freedom, and bravely weathered the total collapse of its very own economic foundation. They know, better than anyone else in the world, that nothing is ever truly permanent, and that true strength is not found in massive steel towers, but in the unbreakable, quiet bonds of a shared community. They are the living embodiment of the words spoken by Father Gabriel Richard on the morning after the entire city burned to the ground in 1805. Spurimus meliora, resurget cineribus. We hope for better things. It will rise from the ashes. As the sun finally sets over the vast, beautiful expanse of Michigan, the sky above Detroit is painted in soft, calming shades of deep purple, burnt orange, and gentle, fading gold. The towering Art Deco buildings downtown catch the very last rays of the dying light, their glowing golden roofs shining like quiet, protective beacons over the tranquil streets. The millions of LED streetlights hum softly to life, casting a warm, safe glow over the quiet green urban farms and the sleeping brick homes. The deep, rhythmic bass lines of the past have faded into a gentle, soothing stillness, leaving only the soft rustle of the wind passing through the ancient oak trees. The heavy, exhausting work of the centuries is finally done. The great engines have come to a peaceful rest, and the magnificent, enduring city of Detroit can finally close its eyes and sleep, waiting quietly for the promise of a beautiful new dawn.